The first sound I heard was not thunder, not a hunting horn, not the clash of my own guard at drill in the yard below my window. It was a woman's voice, low and unhurried, rising from the well in the village square as though she did not know the world had forgotten how to make that sound. I set down the ledger in my hand and did not breathe. For 200 years no note had lived inside the borders of Corvindale. My people spoke plainly, laughed without music in it, wept without keening, because an ancestor of mine had broken a vow to a dying enchantress, and she had answered his cruelty by taking every song out of the mouths of his descendants and everyone who sheltered beneath his roof. Bells rang flat. Birds, it was said, still sang beyond our borders, but any bird that flew into Corvindale's air fell silent mid-note, as if a hand had closed gently over its throat. My court musicians kept their instruments polished and useless, heirlooms of a gift none of us could touch. I had grown up believing music was a story other kingdoms told about themselves, not a thing that could happen here. So when the sound came up through the open window of my study, threading between the stone merlins like something alive, I was on my feet before I had decided to stand. I told myself, walking fast down the tower stair with my captain of the guard, half jogging to keep pace and asking questions I did not answer, that it must be some trick of the wind in the well shaft, some illusion born of my own tiredness after a week of border reports and grain counts. But wind does not shape itself into a melody with a rise and a fall and a place where the breath catches before the next line. Wind does not sound like it is comforting someone. I came out into the square just as the last color drained from the sky, and I saw her. She stood at the low wall around the well with a wooden bucket forgotten at her feet, her shawl slipping from one shoulder, and she was singing, not loudly, not for an audience, but the way a person sings when they believe themselves entirely alone. An old cradle song, half the words worn away by time, the kind of tune a grandmother might hum without remembering where she learned it. Her voice was clear and low, and it did not waver, and everywhere it touched something changed. I watched a shutter that had hung crooked and silent for as long as I could remember swing gently on its hinge and catch itself, as if remembering how to close without a groan. I watched candlelight in a window across the square brighten by a shade, gold instead of gray. I felt it before I understood what I was feeling, a warmth along my arms like standing too near a hearth, though I stood 20 paces from any fire, and beneath my breastbone something I had no name for turned over once, slow and deliberate, like a key finding the one lock it was cut for. I did not move. I did not want to be the reason she stopped. Her name, I would learn within the hour, was Marielle. She kept the house of the old weaver Cecil at the lane's end, ran errands, mended what needed mending, and had lived in Corvindale, by every account, her whole quiet life without anyone remarking on her beyond the fact that she worked hard and troubled no one. She was not a woman the court had ever discussed. She was not a woman I had ever been introduced to. And she was standing in my village square undoing, note by unknowing note, a curse that had outlasted 6 kings before me. When she finished the line she was singing, she startled, pressing a hand to her own mouth as if she had been caught at something shameful, and looked around her with wide eyes, and I understood, watching her face, that she had not done this on purpose. She did not know what she carried. She thought she had simply been humming to herself in an empty square, the way a lonely person does at the end of a long day, and she had no idea that behind her, 3 windows down the lane, an old woman had come to her door for the first time in decades with tears on her face, saying she'd heard her husband's whistle again, the one he used to call the dog, though the dog and the husband had both been dead 10 years. I stepped forward from the shadow of the hall steps, and she saw me, and went very still, and I watched the fear come into her, not fear of me as a man, I would learn later, but fear of what a king does to peasants who make noise where noise is forbidden. "Don't stop on my account," I said, though she already had. "Your Grace." She dropped into a bow so fast and so low I thought she might overbalance into the well. I didn't mean, I wasn't thinking, The song came without my asking it to. I'll not do it again, I swear it. Look at the window behind you, I said. She turned and saw the candle burning gold instead of the gray-white flame everyone in Corvindale had known since birth, and her hand went to her throat as though she might trap the next word before it could escape and do more damage. That is not a punishable thing, I told her, though my own voice was unsteady, which had not happened to me in a public square since I was a boy training with a blade too heavy for my arm. That is the first light that window has thrown in longer than either of us has been alive. She looked at me as if I had told her the moon had fallen into the well behind her, and in fairness, I felt something not unlike that, standing there, the ground under an old certainty giving gently away. I did not tell her what I suspected that night. I did not yet let myself believe it fully myself. I only walked her the short distance to Cecil's cottage in the dusk, my guard trailing a respectful distance behind, and asked her carefully whether anyone had ever taught her that song, and she said her mother had sung it to her before she died, when Marielle was too young to properly remember the shape of her mother's face but not too young to keep the tune. She did not know where her mother had learned it. She did not know that the tune itself did not matter, that it was never about the song. It was about the singer. That night I did not sleep. I sat in my study with the old records spread before me, the ones every alpha king of Corvindale inherits and few of us ever properly read, because who studies the fine print of a curse he assumes will outlast him? I found the passage I half remembered from my father's telling, and had never once thought to take literally. The silence shall hold, the old writing said, in a scrawling hand 2 centuries faded, until a voice untouched by the guilt of the broken vow rises freely within these borders, asking nothing, owed nothing, given without command. Then and only then shall the curse loosen its hand, note by note, as that voice is willing to give it. I read it 7 times, untouched by the guilt of the broken vow. Every soul born into my line, every noble house that had stood beside my ancestor when he broke his word, carried some thread of that old guilt woven into them without their knowing. Old blood remembers what old blood did, even when the mind has forgotten. But a stranger's blood, blood with no old debt in it, blood that had never bent its knee to the bargain that made it. That voice could sing where no one else's could, and the ancient wrong would have no claim to hold against it. Marielle was no noble. She was not, so far as anyone recorded, descended from any household that had stood in that long-ago hall when the enchantress cursed us all. She simply lived here, singing to herself over a well bucket in the way lonely people find comfort in the sound of their own voice, entirely unaware she was the one thing 200 years of Alpha Kings had waited for without knowing to wait. I did not tell her that night what she was. I did not yet know how to say it without it sounding like a burden I was laying across her shoulders, and I did not want that to be the first thing she understood about herself in my company. I only asked, before I left her at Cecil's door, whether she might sing again. "I don't know if I can," she admitted. "I don't know what came over me tonight." "Then don't try to summon it," I said. "Only don't silence it if it comes back on its own." She looked at me a long moment in the last gray light, as if trying to decide whether a king asking a favor of a servant girl was a kindness or a trap, and something in her face, not fear this time, something more like wonder turning over slowly, testing its own weight, made the warmth under my ribs flare again, steadier this time, like a coal someone had breathed on. I walked back to the hall alone. My captain asked at the door whether I wanted the girl watched, brought before the council, questioned about where such a gift had come from. "She is not to be questioned," I said. "She is not to be watched like a prisoner. If anyone frightens her into silence, they answer to me." He looked at me the way a man looks at his king when he suspects something has shifted in him that the king himself has not yet said aloud. I did not explain it to him either. I went up to my tower and stood at the window looking down at the dark lane where her small window still burned, faint gold, and I let myself, for the first time in my adult life, imagine what it might mean if the old prophecy my grandmother used to murmur over embroidery, that the silence would end only when the true mate of a king of Corvindale was found among us, singing without knowing what she sang, had not been a comfort story for children after all. The following days, she did not sing in the square again. I watched for it more than I would admit to any living soul, finding reasons to walk the lane at dusk, to linger near the well on some pretext of inspecting the stonework, and each evening the square remained as it had been for 2 centuries, quiet, correct, entirely without music. I began to fear I had imagined the whole of it, that a tired man's mind had built a miracle out of wind and hope. Then on the 5th evening I heard it again, not from the square this time, but from the weaver's cottage itself, muffled through a shuttered window, so soft I would have missed it if I had not already trained my ear to listen for exactly this. I stopped in the lane. Old Cecil's chimney, which had smoked black and sullen as every chimney in Corvindale smoked. On account of some small permanent grief the curse had also laid on our fires, burned pale gold through the crack in the shutter. I stood in the cold and listened to a woman singing to what I would later learn was a sick lamb she had taken in to nurse by the hearth, comforting the animal the way she must have once been comforted, and I watched gold light spill wider through the gap in the shutter with every line, as if the song itself were physically pushing the dark back. I did not go to the door. I did not want to make her self-conscious in her own house, and there was a kind of privilege in simply being allowed to witness it, unannounced, the way a man is permitted to watch a sunrise without being invited by the sun. But I stood there long after the song ended, and the light steadied into its new, warmer gold, and I understood that whatever was happening to Corvindale was happening because of her, and that it would go on happening whether or not I ever worked up the courage to tell her so. I began, after that, to find reasons for her to be near the hall. Cecil's rheumatism was real enough. I sent the court physician, who could find nothing curse-touched about the old woman's joints, only ordinary age, and prescribed her a tonic and, more usefully, a lighter workload, which meant Marielle began coming to the kitchen some mornings to help where Cecil no longer could. I told myself this was a kindness to an old subject and nothing more. I do not think anyone in my household believed that particular fiction, least of all my own steward, who began, with a diplomacy I did not ask for and could not quite object to, seating Marielle's mending basket in the sunniest corner of the kitchen courtyard whenever I was known to be walking that way. It was in the great hall, some weeks into that strange golden season, that I first understood how much the whole of Corvindale had been starved without knowing the shape of its own hunger. I had called a modest harvest supper, the kind my father had held every year of his reign more from duty than joy, since a feast with no music in it is only a room full of people eating in careful silence, trying not to notice what is missing. I invited Marielle at Cecil's insistence more than my own courage. I had wanted to, and had talked myself out of it twice, certain the court would read too much into a servant girl seated anywhere near the dais. She came in a plain gray dress with her hair simply bound back, looking as though she wished the floor might open beneath her rather than have every eye in the hall follow her to her seat, and I understood, watching her endure it, that being watched was still new enough to her that it cost her something each time. I gave her the seat nearest the hearth rather than nearest me, so that no one could say I had elevated her beyond her place, and I busied myself with the tedious business of a king's table, the toasts, the grain reports disguised as pleasantries, the long, dull courtesy of it all, while some part of me stayed entirely fixed on the far end of the table where she sat trying to make herself small. Then one of the old servers, a man named Piers who had carried plates in that hall since before I was born, began, without any signal that I saw, to hum under his breath as he cleared a tray. An old serving song, the kind every great house once used to keep its staff moving in rhythm, forgotten along with everything else the curse had taken. He caught himself and went red to his collar, certain he had committed some offense, and the hall went the particular quiet it always went now, waiting to see what would happen. Marielle looked at me down the length of that long table, and I understood the question in her face without her needing to voice it. I nodded, once, the smallest permission I could give her without the whole hall reading it as command. She hummed the next line back to Piers, quiet, encouraging, the way you'd coax a shy child into finishing a rhyme, and he finished it badly off the note and laughed at himself in open relief. And within a few verses half the serving staff were humming some fragment of it under their breath while they worked, and the great hall of Corvindale filled for the first time in 200 years with the ordinary, imperfect, entirely human sound of people singing, while they went about their work because the sound simply wanted to come out of them. I did not dance that night. I have never been much of a dancer, curse or no curse, but I watched her rise unbidden when the serving song gave way to something with more shape to it, and take old Piers by the hand for a slow turn around the hearth floor because he looked, she told me later, like a man who had waited 200 years for exactly that chance and might not get another. The court watched a servant girl teach a serving man to dance again in the hall of their king, and I do not think a single lord among them dared say a disapproving word, because even the coldest of them could feel what was returning to the room, and no one, that night, wanted to be the man remembered for trying to silence it. I found her afterward near the hearth, breathless, laughing, her hair coming loose from its binding, and I told her, low enough that only she could hear it, that I had not seen my own hall look so alive in the whole of my reign. "It isn't me," she said, still catching her breath. "It's them. I only gave them back the first note. They did the rest themselves." "You keep saying that," I said, "as though it makes what you did smaller. It doesn't. A door doesn't open itself, Marielle, whatever the room on the other side of it goes on to do." She had no answer for that beyond the color that rose in her face, and I let her have her silence, because I had already learned by then that some of the truest things that passed between us needed no further words to be understood. We spoke in those weeks in small pieces, the way people do who are each waiting to see whether the other will run. She asked me once, mending a torn sleeve of my own hunting coat with a concentration that made me feel absurdly grateful for a torn sleeve, why I had not had her brought before the council the night of the well. "Because you had done nothing that deserved a council," I said. I broke the peace. Everyone says the silence keeps the peace. "The silence," I said, "kept a punishment. There's a difference between peace and a punishment that outlived the man who earned it." She looked up at that, needle stilled. "You talk about it as though you don't believe in it, the curse." "I believe in it entirely," I said. "I've lived under it my whole life, and so did my father and his father before him. I simply no longer believe it's owed to anyone anymore. A debt 200 years unpaid isn't justice. It's only habit wearing justice's coat." She went back to her mending, but slower, and I saw her mouth curve very slightly at one corner, the first almost smile I had earned from her, and the warmth under my ribs did the thing it had begun doing every time she was near me. Not a leap, not a surge, nothing so violent as that, but a settling, as if some restless animal that had paced the same length of floor my whole life had finally found the one doorway it had been pacing toward and simply, quietly, sat down in it. I did not yet call it a bond. I did not yet let myself. It was the village that named what was happening before I did. Windows kept their light longer into the evening wherever she had passed that day. A miller's wife swore her infant, who had never once made a sound beyond ordinary crying since the day it was born, no coo, no babble, nothing that could be called music even by the most forgiving ear, as the curse forbade it, laughed aloud, a real ringing laugh. On the afternoon Marielle had stopped to admire the child in its basket and hummed 3 notes to make it smile. The old bell in the north chapel, which had not rung true in 200 years, only clanged flat and joyless on the hour, began to carry the faintest true note beneath the flat one, like a second voice remembering how to harmonize with the first. They began to call her the quiet singer before they knew her name properly, and then, once her name spread, they simply called her blessed, and left small gifts at Cecil's door: eggs, a warm shawl, a jar of honey, the way people leave offerings for something they do not yet dare call a miracle outright for fear of jinxing it. I watched her try to refuse the gifts and fail, watched her flush with an embarrassment that had nothing false in it, and understood that she still did not believe what she was. She thought she was lucky. She did not yet know she was chosen. I told her at last, on an evening when we walked the wall above the river, because Cecil had sent her to me with a message about the tonic, and I had, shamelessly, invented 3 more questions to keep her there, once the message was delivered. I told her what the old record said. I told her about the enchantress and the broken vow, and the 2 centuries of gray candles and flat bells and birds that fell silent crossing our borders. I told her that her blood, untouched by that old debt, was the only blood in 200 years that could unmake what my ancestors' cruelty had made. She was quiet a long while after I finished, looking out over the dark river, and when she spoke her voice was smaller than I had yet heard it. "So it was never mine," she said. "The song, it was only ever a key. Any voice free of the old guilt could have done it. It didn't need to be me." "It needed to be someone," I said. "It happened to be you. I don't think there's a way to separate a key from the hand that turns it and call the turning meaningless." "You're kind to say so." "I'm not being kind," I said, more sharply than I meant to, and she looked at me in surprise. "Forgive me. I only mean I have watched a curse unravel one window at a time because you were tired enough, one evening, to hum to yourself over a well bucket. I have watched an infant laugh for the first time in its life because you thought it was sweet enough to hum 3 notes at. Those are not small things, whoever else might have done them in your place. No one else did do them. You did." She looked away from me, out at the river, and I saw her throat work, and when she spoke again it was so quiet the wind nearly took it. "I always thought there was something wrong with me, growing up, that I hummed when I shouldn't, that I couldn't help it even when Cecil hushed me for fear of the watch. I thought I was flawed for it." "You were never flawed," I said. "You were early. The curse simply hadn't caught up yet to what you were going to undo." I did not tell her that night about the mate bond, though I felt it the entire length of our walk along the wall. Not a howl in my blood, not some wild thing rearing up to claim her, but something far stranger and, I think, far better suited to a man my age and my burdens. A kind of quiet I had not known since before I took the crown, as if some part of me that had been standing at attention my whole reigning life had finally, in her presence, been given leave to stand at ease. I did not want to hand her a second impossible truth on top of the first. I let her carry only the curse that night, and carried the bond alone a little longer, the way a man carries the good news he is afraid of saying aloud too soon in case saying it breaks it. Word of what was happening in Corvindale did not stay inside Corvindale's borders long. A trading caravan from the eastern hill country came through within the month, merchants who had heard rumors of a kingdom finding its voice again, and wanted to see for themselves whether the old stories about our silence were even true, since most of them had grown up believing Corvindale was simply a place where people did not care for music, rather than a place forbidden it. They arrived on a market day, and by chance, though I no longer fully believe in chance where Marielle is concerned. She was in the square that afternoon helping Cecil sell wool, and a child in the caravan party, fretful from the road, would not be soothed by anything his mother tried. Marielle knelt by the cart without being asked and sang to him, the same half-remembered cradle song, or near enough to it, and the whole square went the particular still it went now whenever she sang, shutters catching their hinges, the flat bell in the chapel finding its true note and holding it a beat longer than before, and the traders stood with their hands full of wool and their mouths open, and one of the older merchants, a woman with silver in her braids, said, loud enough for half the square to hear, "I have crossed 9 kingdoms, and I have never heard a curse unhappen in front of my own eyes." That was the moment, I think, The whole of Corvindale allowed itself to believe it was truly ending, rather than some passing grace that might be snatched back. That was also, unfortunately, the moment several of my own council decided the matter had grown too large to leave unmanaged, and I was summoned that same evening to a meeting I had not called, in a hall suddenly full of men eager to tell me what a discovery like Marielle was owed to the throne. "She ought to be brought into the household properly," said Lord Hendrick, who had never in my memory used the word properly about anything that did not also serve his own advancement. "Trained, presented. If her voice is the key to the curse, your grace, it belongs under the crown's protection, not left loose in a weaver's cottage at the lane's end." "She is not a key that belongs to anyone," I said. "She is a woman. And a woman who may finish undoing 200 years of curse is not made safer by being caged for it. Other kingdoms would pay any price to have a voice like that under their own roof instead of ours," someone pressed. "Surely your grace sees the danger of leaving something so valuable unguarded." I understood, even through my anger, that the fear beneath the words was not entirely selfish. A voice that could break curses might, in cruder hands, be made to do worse. But I had watched enough of history's kindnesses curdle into captivity, dressed up as protection, to know exactly where this proposal led. "If you bring her into this household as a possession to be guarded," I said, "you will have done nothing different from what the enchantress did to us 200 years ago. You will only have replaced one cage with a nicer one. I did not survive being cursed my whole life to become the man who cages the one voice that ends it." They did not love that answer, but I was still their king, and I left no room in my tone for further debate. I did, however, walk out of that hall with a colder understanding of what I owed Marielle, not protection in the sense of walls and guards, though I meant to see she came to no harm, but protection from becoming, in the eyes of my own court, a thing rather than a person. I resolved that whatever happened between us, whatever the bond wanted to become, it would happen because she chose it and at no other pace than hers. I went to her the next morning and told her plainly what had been said in that hall, because I would not have her learn second-hand that men had sat in a room discussing what to do with her as though she were livestock. She listened with her hands very still in her lap, and when I finished she asked, "And what do you want done with me, your grace?" "Nothing done with you," I said. "I want you asked. That is the whole of what I want, different from what they proposed. Whatever comes next, whether you go on singing, whether you never sing again, whether you stay in Cecil's cottage the rest of your days and let the last windows in Corvindale go on burning gray, it will be because you chose it. No one will command your voice out of you. Not my counsel. Not me." She looked at me a long moment, and something in her face eased, the way a shoulder eases when a weight it has braced against is finally set down. "No one has ever asked me that before," she said. "Whether I wanted a thing. People have always simply needed things from me, Cecil needing help with the house, the village needing an extra pair of hands at harvest. I don't think anyone has asked me what I want since my mother died." "Then I am asking now," I said. "What do you want, Marielle?" She did not answer that day. But she did not need to, not fully, not yet. I saw the question take root in her the way a seed takes root, quietly, where no one can see it working, and I was content, for the first time in my life, to wait on another person's timing rather than my own. She answered it in her own way some weeks later, on an ordinary evening that I have come to think of since as anything but ordinary. I had ridden out to the kitchen gardens on some pretense of inspecting the new well my steward had ordered dug there, and found her instead sitting on the low garden wall with Cecil's mending basket forgotten beside her, watching the first stars come out over a kingdom that could, by then, see its own candlelight properly for the first time in 200 years. "I used to come out here as a girl," she said, without turning at the sound of my horse, as though she had known it was me by the pace of the hoofbeats alone, which perhaps by then she did. "Before the curse felt like anything more than a story Cecil told to keep me quiet in the square. I used to wonder what the stars sounded like, if anything up there was allowed to sing when nothing down here could. And now you know, I said, dismounting. Now I know they don't sound like anything at all, she said, and there was a laughter under it, soft and unhidden, the kind she had only begun to let me hear in the last month. It was never the stars. It was only ever going to be someone standing under them. I sat beside her on the wall, close enough that our shoulders nearly touched, and for a long while neither of us spoke, and I found I did not need her to. There is a particular kind of peace, I have learned since, in sitting beside a person and needing nothing further from the silence between you, no performance, no proof, no curse to break, only the plain fact of her breathing next to me under a sky finally allowed to feel ordinary. When at last she spoke again, it was to answer, unprompted, the question I had asked her weeks before at the hall. You asked me what I wanted, she said. I want this, not the curse ending, though I'm glad of it. I want evenings like this one, where nobody needs anything sung out of me, where I am only Marielle sitting on a wall with a man who asked me a question, and then had the patience to let me answer it in my own time. Then that is what I mean to give you, I said, for as many evenings as you'll have me for it. She looked at me then and smiled the whole way, not the small caught corner of a smile I had first earned mending my hunting coat, but something wide open and unguarded, and the warmth beneath my ribs answered it so completely that I understood, sitting there under stars that had only just begun to feel like they belonged to us again, that whatever word the old prophecy used for what was growing between us, I had already stopped needing the word to know the thing itself was true. The curse did not lift all at once, the way a rain stops. It lifted the way frost melts off a window, in patches, unevenly, faster where the sun struck longest. By high summer, 3 whole streets near the square carried true color in their candle flames and true tone in any bell rung within them, while the far edges of Corvindale, near the forest border, remained as gray and flat as they had been the day the enchantress laid her hand on us. Marielle went of her own will to those far edges. I did not ask it of her, would not have asked it of her, but she began walking out to the forest hamlets herself, sometimes with Cecile, sometimes alone, singing at wells and hearths the way she had first sung without meaning to, and every place her voice reached, the gray lifted a little further. I went with her when she allowed it, not as her king overseeing a valuable asset, but as a man finding excuses to walk beside a woman he could no longer imagine his days without. I carried her basket. I fixed a hinge or two at cottages we visited badly, because I am a better swordsman than carpenter, and she laughed at my clumsy work the first time I ever heard her laugh outright, a sound as unpracticed and as lovely as her singing, and the warmth beneath my ribs did not merely settle that time. It bloomed, slow and total, like frost finally giving way to the sun Marielle herself had become for this whole gray kingdom. It was on the 100th day of her singing, by the court's count, though I think none of us were counting quite right, since no one had thought to start the tally until the 2nd week, that we walked back into the village square at dusk and found nearly the whole of Corvindale gathered there, drawn by nothing but rumor that something was going to happen, though no one, including Marielle, had planned anything. The last untouched gray lay over the square itself, the very well where I had first heard her voice, the last stubborn patch of the old curse holding on exactly where it had first begun to break. She looked at the crowd, and then at me, and I saw the fear flicker through her, not of the curse, not any longer, but of all those faces turned toward her waiting for a miracle on command, the very thing I had promised her would never be asked of her. You don't owe them this tonight, I said, quiet enough that only she could hear it. You don't owe anyone a performance. If you would rather go home, I will walk you home myself and tell them the show is over before it began. Is that truly still mine to choose? It was never anyone's to take from you. She held my gaze a moment, and something passed between us that had nothing to do with curses or crowds, only 2 people deciding, in the space of a breath, that they trusted each other with a great deal more than either had said aloud yet. Then she turned back to the well, closed her eyes and began, not the cradle song this time, but something I had never heard her sing before, something slower that seemed to rise out of her rather than out of memory, as though the 200 years of silence itself had been waiting for exactly this voice to finally give it permission to end. I have tried since to find words equal to what happened in me as she sang that last verse over the well, and I will only say what I saw and felt, plainly, the way I would report it to no one but her. The gray stone of the well went warm-colored under the dusk light, the way old stone looks after a whole day of sun. Every window ringing the square lit gold at once together, as if a single unseen hand had finally opened every shutter the enchantress's curse had shut 2 centuries before. The flat chapel bell rang once on its own, full and round and true, and held its note long after any ordinary bell would have gone silent. And under my own ribs, where I had felt a slow warmth building for months, I felt something entirely new. Not a howl, not a surge, nothing our old stories had prepared me to expect from a mate bond completing itself. I felt instead, as if a held breath I had not known I was holding my whole life finally let go, all at once, painless and total, like a hand unclenching after a lifetime curled into a fist. The square did not cheer. I think we were all too stunned for cheering. We simply stood in that impossible gold light, listening to a chapel bell ring true for the first time in 200 years, and watched Marielle open her eyes and look around her at what her own voice had finished. And I do not think in that moment she yet understood that she had also finished something in me. She turned and found me already looking at her, and whatever she saw in my face made her go very still. "Ansel," she said, my name, not my title, for the first time since we had known each other, and I felt that small, unadorned syllable land somewhere near where the old ache used to live. "What is happening to you? You look as though you've seen something greater than the curse breaking." "I have," I said. "I have watched the one thing my whole life was waiting for arrive, and I very nearly let 200 years of habit convince me it would never come. I will not pretend I found some perfect courtly speech for what came next. I do not think perfect speeches exist for a moment like that one, only true ones. I told her, there in front of half of Corvindale, though I addressed only her, that the bond every alpha king before me had been promised and never lived to see was not a thing that had happened to me that evening. It had been happening slowly, unglamorously, across an entire summer of mended sleeves and clumsy hinges, and a laugh I would trade half my kingdom to hear again. And that I had let it happen at her pace precisely, because I never wanted her to feel commanded into it the way the curse had once commanded silence into all of us. "I am not telling you this to claim anything," I said. "You have already given Corvindale back its voice without being asked. I would not have you think I expect you to give me anything in turn, simply because some old prophecy said a king's mate would be found singing among his people. Whatever this is between us, it is only real if it is something you would have chosen even without a curse to break or a prophecy to fulfill." She was quiet long enough that I feared, for one cold moment, I had said too much too plainly in front of too many people. Then she stepped closer, close enough that I could see the gold window light reflected new in her eyes, and said, "I have been choosing you for weeks, Ansel. I only didn't know I was allowed to say so before you did." I did not sweep her into some grand embrace before the whole square, because that was never the shape of what had grown between us, and because I think we both understood, without needing to say it, that whatever came next belonged to the two of us and not to an audience, however joyful. I only took her hand, there by the well where I had first heard her sing, and felt that unclenched, breathing warmth beneath my ribs settle into something I understood, at last, plainly, as home. The chapel bell rang a second time on its own before the crowd finally found their voice and began, tentatively, almost disbelieving of their own throats, to sing back to her. Some old harvest round half of them barely remembered the words too, off-key and uneven and utterly unashamed. The first communal song Corvindale had raised in 200 years, and I stood there holding Marielle's hand, and listening to my kingdom remember how to sound like itself again. Lord Hendrik came to me himself, some days after the well, and I expected some fresh argument dressed as counsel, some new proposal for how best to make use of what Marielle had become to Corvindale. Instead, he stood before me looking, for the first time since I had known him, uncertain of his own footing. "My granddaughter sang to me last night, Your Grace," he said. "An ordinary tune, nothing grand, something she'd learned from another child in the lane. I have not heard a child of my own line sing since before I was born. I did not know, until I heard it, how much I had been carrying the absence of it without a name for the weight." He paused, and something in his face worked before he mastered it. "I spoke against the girl in this hall. I would ask your Grace's leave to unspeak it, if such a thing can be done." "It can," I said, "and it has been, the moment you said so plainly. Corvindale does not need you sorry in private, my lord. It needs you honest in the same hall where you were wrong." He bowed lower than protocol required and left, and I did not think less of him afterward for having been wrong first, only more of him for saying so once he knew better, which is a rarer thing in a council chamber than most kings are given credit for expecting. In the season since Corvindale has become, I am told by the same traders who once thought our silence a strange foreign custom, a kingdom known for its music rather than its quiet, for harvest songs in the square and lullabies drifting from open windows, and a chapel bell that never again forgets its note. I did not bring Marielle into my household as my council once wished, as a treasure to be guarded behind walls. She still visits Cecile most mornings, still mends what wants mending, still sings to fretful lambs and fretful children with no more ceremony than she ever did, and if anything has changed in how Corvindale regards her, it is only that they no longer need to call her blessed in a whisper, as though naming the miracle too loudly might frighten it away. They simply call her by her name, the way you name someone who has always, quietly, belonged among you. I think of that first evening often, more often than a king with a kingdom's worth of business ought to allow himself. How close I came to staying at my window, ledger in hand, telling myself it was only wind in the well shaft, and going back to my grain counts as though nothing in the world had changed. I do not think it matters now which of us the old prophecy was truly written for, the king or the voice he could not stop listening to. I only know I have spent every evening since finding some fresh reason to stand near enough to hear her, and I intend to spend every evening left to me doing exactly the same. As for what passed between us that evening at the well, I have found I do not need grander words for it than the ones she gave me herself. She chose me before either of us had proof it was safe to say so. I mean to spend the rest of my reign proving her right for having done it, not with vows shouted from a dais, but the way she taught this whole kingdom to trust its own voice again. Quietly, one true note at a time, in a house where every window, at last, is allowed to burn warm after dark,